These mice absolutely terrify me. They're the most villainous, cold-hearted mice you'll ever meet, especially Kingpin Keith, today's mouse of the day. And I thought, since we're heading into Halloween time, I'm just going to do the most evil mice I've ever seen because it's a little bit of a scary story, guys. And I've got the dark room with the candlelight to make it a little bit ominous for today's Mouse of the Day video, which is a very ominous video. Kingpin Keith sat at the head of a massive oak table deep in the underground tunnels of the Wisconsin dairy farms, and his cold, calculated eyes darted around the room to see his closest allies, Conman Connor and Matthew Mozzarella. "I've been thinking," Keith began. "The Cheese Council thinks they have control of the state's cheese industry, but they have no idea who really runs Wisconsin." Conman Connor leaned forward. His eyes darted around the room as if he couldn't sit still. His hands twitched, a habit he'd developed since losing his kids in that tragic accident. He always was a nervous wreck, but he was also brilliant and able to twist the truth and manipulate others with ease. "What's the plan, Keith?" "There's a factory up north," Keith said slowly, each word laced with malice. "It's the largest cheese producer in the state. They supplied the Cheese Council with resources, and as long as that factory operates, the Cheese Council remains strong." Matthew Mozzarella, being the new member of the three, said there was no room for sentimentality in his heart, and he lived for destruction and violence and chaos. That's basically it. He had a special knack for making his enemies disappear, and he said, "So let's burn it down." Keith smiled darkly. "Not just burn it, but destroy it completely, and then we're going to replace it." Connor's head tilted. His twitchy fingers were tapping on the table. "Replace it? With what?" Keith leaned back in his chair, deepening into the shadows, and said, "A new factory. One that looks identical to the old one, but instead of producing cheese, it'll produce poison disguised as cheese. No one will know the difference until it's way too late." Connor's eyes widened. "Poison cheese? That's brilliant, Keith. No one will suspect a thing. They'll keep buying the cheese, eating it, feeding it to their families." Keith nodded slowly. "Exactly. We'll weaken them from the inside. The poison will act slowly, spreading through the population. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, all of Wisconsin will be under our control." Matthew said, "And what about the Cheese Council? They'll catch on eventually, won't they?" "They won't have time to catch on," Keith said, his voice cold and assured. "Once we take out the cheese factory, their supply chain will be crippled, and they'll be too busy trying to rebuild it to notice what we're doing." Connor's mind raced as he thought about the logistics of this whole thing. This plan was bigger than anything they'd done before. They weren't just taking out a rival or knocking over a shipment of cheese. This was an attack on the very heart of Wisconsin's cheese industry. And Connor, with his knack for deception, knew he would make this all go through without a hitch. "I'll spread rumors," Connor said, his voice quickening with excitement. "Make it look like the explosion was an accident. Maybe a faulty machine or a gas leak. The authorities will investigate, but they won't find anything suspicious." Keith nodded, satisfied. "Good. We need it to look like a tragic accident, something no one could have prevented. The factory workers will survive, and they'll help us by telling the story of what went wrong. They'll be our unwilling allies. And once we build the new factory," Matthew said, his voice a low growl, "we start shipping the poison cheese." Keith's smile widened. "Precisely. And once the poison cheese hits the market, it'll spread like wildfire. Every grocery store, every kitchen table. The mice of Wisconsin will have no idea what's happening until it's too late." Connor's grin widened as the plan unfolded. In his mind, he could already see it. The chaos, the confusion, the panic would be beautiful. "When do we start?" he asked eagerly to get moving. "Tonight, Connor. You'll handle the authorities. Create a diversion, something big enough to pull their attention away from the factory. Matthew, you plant the explosives." Matthew grunted his agreement. How much time do we need?" Keith thought for a moment. We'll give them a week to rebuild. During that time, we'll make sure that the public is fully convinced that the factory's destruction was a terrible accident. Then we move in." Connor's fingers twitched with excitement. He loved chaos. The more disorder he could create, the better. And with this plan, it seemed like chaos was just the beginning. "I'll make sure the authorities are just chasing their tails all night," Conman Connor said. "Yeah, they're going to be fully occupied and not paying attention to this at all." Matthew, on the other hand, was all about business. "What about the workers? You said they need to survive." "Yes, they need to survive, but don't let that stop you from making it look convincing. We want the destruction to be very grand, but we don't want suspicion, and we don't want to hurt innocent mice. Just yet. Don't worry. I'll make it look like an accident." "Thanks, boss." Later that night, the plan was set in motion. Connor, the ever-master manipulator, had spread rumors of a massive cheese heist on the other side of town. The local authorities, eager to protect the state's most valuable resource, were out in full force, leaving the real target completely unguarded. Matthew and his crew moved swiftly through the shadows, slipping into the factory unnoticed. The building was silent, except for the hum of some machines that would soon be nothing. Matthew's team worked efficiently, placing explosives at the key structural points of the building throughout the factory. Outside, Connor kept watch. His eyes were darting nervously around the deserted street. He'd done his job, no one was coming, but even now he couldn't shake the feeling that something might go wrong. His kid's face flashed in his mind for a second, but he pushed them away. This was his life now, and he couldn't afford to be weak. All he knew was chaos. Inside, Matthew lit the fuse. By the time the fire department arrived, the building was nothing more than a smoldering pile of debris. Connor grinned, watching from a safe distance. "Well done, Matthew," he muttered to himself. "Well done." The news of the explosion spread quickly. Headlines in every paper across the state read, "Tragic factory accident. Largest cheese producer in Wisconsin destroyed." The Cheese Council was in a frenzy, scrambling to figure out who did this and how to recover from the loss. But just as Keith had planned, no one suspected foul play. It was, after all, a freak accident. Meanwhile, Keith and his team were already hard at work building the new factory. To the public, it just looked like a heroic act to rebuild after the tragedy. But behind closed doors, the real operation began. Inside the factory, secret machines churned out wheels of poison. The process was flawless, identical to any cheese production except for the deadly toxin that was laced with every bite. The poison was subtle, designed to act slowly and weaken mice over time. They would grow sick, not immediately ill, but the sickness would spread throughout their body, and soon it would be too late. Matthew and Connor stood next to Keith as the first batch rolled off the production line. "This is genius," Connor said, his voice filled with awe. "They'll never see it coming." Keith smiled, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "That's the beauty of it. By the time they realize what's happening, we'll have complete control." "What's the next move with this cheese, Keith?" Keith turned to him, his expression unreadable. "We wait. The poison will do its work, and the Cheese Council will be powerless to stop it. Soon we'll make our move out, and Wisconsin will be ours." Connor's grin widened. "And what about the Cheese Council?" Keith's smile faded, replaced with a cold, ruthless expression. "When the time comes, they'll pay for it if they're standing in our way. But first, we'll let them suffer." Matthew cracked his knuckles, eager for the day when they could take down the Cheese Council once and for all. But for now, they would wait, watching as their plan unfolded. The poisoned cheese made its way into every corner of the state, every grocery store, subtly infiltrating homes, schools, and businesses. At first, no one noticed anything was wrong, but slowly mice across all of Wisconsin began to fall ill. Doctors were baffled, unable to pinpoint the cause. And as the sickness grew, so did Keith's control. And honestly, if you're in Wisconsin right now, I'd be very, very careful because he's rolling this plan out right now. So, I thought leading into Halloween, I needed to pick a very, very scary mouse. And also, I needed to educate you guys on his presence because for my people in Wisconsin, I'm going to need you to be really, really careful because all your cheese might be getting poisoned right now by Kingpin Keith. So, please go check it. Please get your cheese tested. You don't want to be eating Kingpin Keith's evil poison cheese.